Story of the World, Volume 2, Chapter 33, Spain, Portugal, and the New World. Part 1, The Slave Trade. When Ferdinand and Isabella paid for the ships that took Columbus, Amerigo Vespucci, and many other explorers across the Atlantic Ocean, they weren't just being kind. They hoped to make money from this new world. When Columbus landed in America, he claimed the country for Spain. That meant that the King and Queen of Spain were saying, "We have the right to send ships to this country, to establish new cities on it, and to take any gold and treasure that we discover here." Of course, other countries wanted a part of the New World as well. Portugal also sent explorers to the New World. Soon, the Spanish and the Portuguese were both sending ships across the Atlantic. They hoped to build new cities on the coast of the American continents and also on the islands just off South America, which they called the West Indies. But the land where they wanted to settle was already occupied by native tribes. Soon, Spanish and Portuguese soldiers, called conquistadores, were fighting with the Aztecs, the Mayans, and the Incas who lived in Central and South America. They fought with the Native Americans who lived on the islands of the West Indies, and the Spanish and the Portuguese also fought with each other. Finally, Spain and Portugal made a deal. They agreed to divide the land in Central and South America. From now on, Spanish soldiers would claim some of the land, while the Portuguese would settle their colonists in other parts of the new country. This was the beginning of a very sad time in history. The Spanish and the Portuguese didn't treat the people of Central and South America well. Instead of making treaties with them, they marched into the cities of the Aztecs and Incas and into the villages of the Mayans and killed thousands of people. They destroyed temples, houses, and palaces. They built settlements and claimed the land as their own. But as the Spanish and Portuguese began to live in their new settlements, they realized that they needed more help. They needed farmers to grow crops to feed the colonists who would come and live in the new cities. They needed miners to help them dig gold out of the ground. And they needed rowers to help pull their heavy ships across the water. The easiest way to get this help was to buy slaves. After all, you didn't have to pay a slave any money. Once you bought a slave, he had to work for you until he died. So the Spanish and Portuguese began to buy slaves from the Muslim traders who lived in North Africa. For many years, these Muslim traders had bought slaves from the West African empires of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai. Slavery was a part of life in these empires. Sometimes poor men would sell themselves as slaves so that their families could have more money. More often, the generals and kings of West Africa would capture enemy soldiers in battle and then sell them to Muslim traders. These slaves didn't have a good life, but at least they lived in Africa. Sometimes they were even given a chance to buy their freedom back or to earn liberty after years of faithful service. But when the Spanish and Portuguese bought slaves, they took these slaves halfway around the world, far, far away from their African homes. And the slaves taken to the New World had no chance of ever becoming free. The demand for slaves soon became huge. Muslim traders who brought slaves from the Africans could no longer provide enough slaves. When this happened, the Spanish and Portuguese made slaves out of the Central American tribes. And they also decided to get their own African slaves. Spanish and Portuguese ships sailed down the West African coast and dropped anchor. They sent parties of armed men into West African villages and kidnapped the villagers. These Africans weren't men who had been captured in battle. They were ordinary villagers, men, women, and even small children. They were put into chains, packed onto ships, and taken on the long, rough journey to the West Indies and to the coasts of Central and South America. The journey, which took months, became known as the Middle Passage. Slaves on the Middle Passage weren't allowed up on the decks of the ships, so they went for months without any fresh air or sunshine. They weren't given enough to eat or drink. Many died on the long, wretched journey. And when they did arrive in the New World, they were forced to work without any hope of ever escaping this new and horrible life. The slave trade helped the Europeans to build new, wealthy colonies in the New World, but it also killed hundreds of thousands of West Africans, and it even turned the West African people against each other. Some West African tribes realized that they could make a lot of money by selling other Africans as slaves. So they began to kidnap members of other West African tribes to sell to the white slave traders. The slave trade continued for over 200 years. You see, at this time in history, many people in Europe believed that people with dark skin weren't as human as people with light skins. They thought of dark-skinned people the way you or I would think of a horse or a dog. So Europeans often treated the brown-skinned people of South America and the black-skinned people of West Africa as if they were not really human at all. Author's note: although United States history tends to focus on the English slave trade which provided slaves to North America, England did not join the slave trade until the 17th century,